Hello and welcome to Worlds Apart. Making the world a better place has become the rallying cry for many, from housewives to presidents. But in our obsession to create a new reality, aren't we losing sight of the one that we have? Well, to discuss that, I'm now joined by philosopher, psychoanalyst, and one of the world's leading intellectuals, Slavoj Zizek. Mr. Zizek, it's so great to have you on the show. Thank you for this opportunity.
It's a great pleasure.
I would actually like to start with love. I know that in many of your public speeches, you lament the fact that people have stopped falling in love, that love is becoming more rational and devoid of the intensity of human emotion. But I think quite the opposite thing is happening with hatred, because not only hatred is becoming more intense, but all the traditional safeguards like political correctness, education, no longer seem to be able to contain it. And I would like to ask you, how would you explain that?
I think my basic answer is a very simple one, that precisely these protective measures that you mentioned, politically correct rules and so on, they don't work. They, in a way, ossify, fix hate. Hate remains there. You have just to look when somebody with politically correct attitudes attacks you. I'm not just making the primitive point that his very attack on you displays hatred. But how precisely the politically correct rules just enable you to oppress, to render invisible your hatred, but it's still there, transfixed. I think that again, to break the ice, in the sense of break this cold distance where we are brutally identifying the other with some racist cliches and so on. There is no direct way. We cannot, let's say we are of different races and each of us will say, oh, I know you are the victim of certain cliches. I think that what absolutely doesn't work, that would be my first paradox, is to say, let's drop the cliches and open up to the other the way he or she really is. Well, what if the opposite holds, that maybe the way to break the ice is to ironically play with cliches themselves? When I talk with people from other nations, what we enjoy so much is to, in a mocking way, adopt the racist cliche and make fun of it.
Well, I think sometimes I get a feeling that in the modern day geopolitics, we are taking this play with the cliches perhaps too far. And what I mean by that is that in the current geopolitical discourse, it is more and more framed in these Manichaean terms. I mean, it is as if everybody is reading, Lord of the Rings, and here's the good side, here's the bad side. And that's a very natural thing for humans to do, but at the same time, it's very primitive. I mean, it cuts your ability for analysis and self-reflection. And I would like to ask you the question, whether you believe that's just an oversimplification that is inherent in our cognitive ability, or do you believe that it is serving a specific agenda, to divide the world into good and bad sides?
Yes, I totally agree with you, but I would just complicate it on one point. Isn't it the paradox that precisely those who claim, like in the so-called permissive West, life is complex, it's fashionable to say today that we are against binary logic and so on, at a higher level, they treat others precisely according to this binary law, like we are complex, open, the others are simplified.
Absolutely, I agree with that totally, but do you think that's a conscious, deliberate drive to, think of yourself as very sophisticated and of the other as very primitive?
It doesn't matter for me if it's conscious or not. I think
but it's important for the setup,
which is false, deeply false in what we call this liberal, permissive culture and so on and so on. The way they treat the others, there you can see clearly what is false in this culture.
But I mean, the reason why it's important is because it is very much expressed in geopolitics, because many of the upheavals we had in the Middle East, for example, and it's not just the Western involvement, but I mean, what happened in Iraq, what happened in Libya, what happened in Syria was within the framework that Western countries know what is good for those people, for those poor Arabs, and supporting democracy there. So, this idea of that you somehow on the side of the good and those, poor tyrants on the side of the bad, it has very, very significant consequences.
I agree with you, but I would just, again, that's my profession as a philosopher, complicate things further. What I don't like is another dichotomy. For example, it's so fashionable to say, apropos Muslim fundamentalism, not only we are good, they are bad, but to distinguish in the other, like Islam in itself, a good religion, and on the other hand, there are some terrorists who are misusing it, and so on and so on. For example, today in Western liberal leftist circles, you almost cannot criticize Islam. You are immediately accused of Islamophobia and so on and so on.
Absolutely, you cannot criticize Islam, but at the same time, you can show, the profit for millions and millions of people with his pants down. I mean, the Charlie Hebdo controversy.
Here I agree with you, and of course we can immediately stumble upon what is false in the West limitations. For example, of course, I'm horrified at Holocaust deniers and so on. But nonetheless, look, we were so shocked about the intolerance of Arabs, of Muslims, when you have caricatures of Muhammad. But try to publish in the West, not offensive, but just a text which casts some doubts of, like, was it really 6 million Jews that died in Holocaust? Was it not maybe 3-4 million? You're immediately accused. Or try to make fun, I'm not for it. Try to make fun of raped women and so on. What I'm saying is that every culture has a taboo, has things that you are not allowed to touch. Mm-hmm. It's not simply with us, we are free, open, and the others are primitive. That's why I think another distinction has to be made here. We in the West, we are caught between two extremes. On the one hand, we claim we are totally open, permissive, no limits. On the other hand, we have the logic of political correctness and so on, where almost everything becomes prohibited. We oscillate between the two, while this so much despised, criticized other countries, maybe they have a much more subtle way of, like, instead of trying to regulate everything, they just leave some things in the shadow, like homosexuality. Absolutely. You don't talk about it, discreetly you do it, everything is okay.
I would like to steer the conversation towards violence. You wrote a book on violence back in 2008, and there you made a distinction between subjective violence, the one that is perpetrated by an agent, and objective violence, the one that is inherent within the system. And since that book was published in 2008, the world has been plunged into a series of revolutions, or so-called revolutions, that were aiming at overhauling the systems, the corrupt systems. Yeah. So they were trying to get rid of that objective violence. Now, my question to you is whether what happened since that perhaps changed your view on objective and subjective violence, because you taught for all your life, you were sort of lobbying for the fight against that violence within the system. But don't you think that subjective violence that we saw in Libya, in Syria, that perhaps we are seeing in Ukraine right now, is much bloodier? I mean, I'm sure those systems were unfair, those systems were exploitative, but they didn't kill just as many people as the subjective violence.
Do you think, okay, I have some doubts here. Look, for me, objective violence is also what I would have called violence which is not the violence of a change, but violence needed, which has to be exercised just for the things to remain the way they are. And I still think there is an incredible amount of violence going on here. Just my big example, take Congo, which is my royal example. In the last 10-20 years, millions of people died there. Nobody notices it. It's simply part of the system. The second point would have been that this violence that we are witnessing today, we have nonetheless to distinguish between, I'm still a naive leftist, and I would have called it authentic emancipatory violence, and then ethnic fundamentalist violence, and so on and so on.
Mr. Zizek, again, emancipatory, or as you called it, divine violence, this popular unrest that is aiming to overthrow a corrupt or unfair system.
Where did you see great violence in Egypt, for example?
Well, I think more people have been killed in Egypt since the resignation of Mubarak than during the protests.
Yeah, but it was strictly Islamists and the military. It was the reaction. I don't see any great violence in what people were doing on Tahrir Square and so on.
Well, people were, that may be a secret to you, but they raped quite a number of women there. I mean,
Who?
People who were on the Tahrir Square, including Lara Logan, a famous American reporter. But
yeah, but by whom? I mean, I still, because I know things in detail there. My friends were there, they reported to me.
I mean, my point here is that, and I heard you say that the biggest problem with revolution is the morning after, whether that sort of popular mobilization could be sustained. But if I stretch that metaphor a bit further, isn't the main problem with what is actually born out of the revolution 9 months or let's say 2 years down the line? Because I don't see any positive examples of that popular unrest that you seem to be glorifying. I mean, with referring to the revolution as divine, divine violence. Why is it divine?
Here, okay. First, what do I mean by divine violence? Here, my distinction is more subtle, if I may say so. I don't think divine violence is anything to be glorified. It's something that is even horrible. For me, divine violence was, for example, you remember a couple of years ago when cars were burning in Paris suburbs. Or now, sometimes when the protests against white caps shooting blacks there, it's the violence which has no goal, it's just an explosion of rage. It's horrible. If I were to be there, I would shoot back. Yeah, I'm just saying that it's a symptom of a certain deadlock.
Absolutely, but that symptom is very easily exploited by political circles, and that's always happens in revolution. You remember that famous Carlyle quote that revolution is started by enthusiasts and it is always used by scoundrels. So I wonder, why do people still seem to be infatuated with this notion of revolution, yourself including?
I am not talking so much as revolution in the sense of barricades, hundreds of thousands of people on the street and so on and so on. What I'm saying is as simple as this. I see the world moving in a certain direction. If nothing changes, there will be a catastrophe. Geopolitically, we are getting in a very dangerous situation. Practically, everyone is already talking about a new Third World War and so on, and new apartheid is emerging everywhere. So for me, the true catastrophe will be if nothing changes, if things just go on the way they are.
Mr. Zizek, on that point, I have to agree with you. We have to take a very, very short break now, but when we come back, Ukraine and Russia, can the two learn anything from the catastrophic experience of Yugoslavia? That's coming up in a moment on Worlds Apart. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Worlds Apart, where we are discussing political philosophy with Slavoj Zizek. Mr. Zizek, before the break, we were talking about this revolutionary violence, and one of the things that you always encounter there is some sort of a conversation about dreams and inspirations. And I heard you say once that Martin Luther King, everybody knows that Martin Luther King had a dream. Nobody knows what that dream was, and I think that's pretty much what the current geopolitics is all about. Everybody is pushing that brand of dreams. I mean, Americans are pushing democracy, radical Islamists are pushing for a caliphate, Russians has just woken up from their, communist dream, they're looking for a new dream. So everybody is doing that. And as somebody who has seen the consequences of that geopolitical dreaming in many of the war zones, I wonder, how do you make people to stop indulging in those fantasies and actually appreciate the life that they have around them? Why is it less important than, those lofty ideas about fairness and how society should be organized?
But I don't think that when ordinary people really explode on the streets, I don't think they are following some precise dream program. They are just simply desperate. They experience...
Absolutely, but they don't realize that they may lose even what they have. Again, in Libya, when I was covering it, people were comparing themselves to the living standards of Saudi Arabia, but the country that is next to them is also Yemen, where the living standards are much lower. So when people do that, they don't understand that the situation has just as much possibility of turning for worse rather than for better. Isn't that an inherent danger of revolution?
Now we are approaching high theoretical stuff, because I claim, but it's a highly theoretical point, that precisely in actual social life, you cannot simply distinguish between the reality and the dreams. The dreams are constitutive of that reality. Like, you experience reality through the structure of dreams. I don't think you can abstract dreams. This is why, now comes my second conclusion, which may shock you. Everybody is attacking its popular philosophers, like we are guilty. We impose our crazy rational notions of a new society. The result is totalitarianism. Isn't it time to blame the poets also? I claim there is no ethnic cleansing without poetry. Poetry, I mean not just poetry in the narrow sense, but mythology, religion, and so on and so on. Because now I will refer to your example. In everyday life, we are, most of us at least, okay, there is egotism, hypocrisy, but we have usually certain levels of elementary dignity, like to be tasteless. If somebody were to tell me now that I have with a knife to pick out your eyes and eat them or whatever, I would have some problems. How to make me do it? You need a poet, I claim. Somebody which...
Or a revolutionary who will...
Yeah, but revolutionaries need poets also. Poets in the sense that there has to be what you called a strong dream, mythic vision, which makes me, which renders possible for me to obliterate, to overcome
Absolutely.
my
so
basic
at the end of the day, you
decency.
agree with me that we should all stop dreaming in geopolitics and start appreciating what we actually have. And this is actually, not the kind of argument that you endorsed all your life. You've been trying to change the reality rather than appreciate what you already have.
Yeah, but on the other hand, I would say, okay, take East Germany in the last years of real socialism. Okay, you can also say they should have looked at what they had. They had maybe East Germany, DDR, the highest living standard among all socialist countries and so on. But dreams were there, dreams in the sense of comparing yourself with West Germany. And what I claim is that you never can abstract this dimension
but
of dreams.
It's not abstract.
This is how people make
but
revolutions.
the geopolitical reality at that time was very, very different, and the so-called East Germany revolution came about in a very, very different way from, let's say, the Libyan revolution. So again, maybe it is the East Germany revolution that was an exception rather than the rule, in a sense of producing so little or no casualties, which is, mass
but
violence.
Here I would nonetheless insist on this distinction. I see your point. For example, I think that there is one measure of authentic popular violence. Okay, there always can be excesses, what you said, rage, but that people just occupy public space and say, we don't move from here, and pose certain demands, but then there is no, at least essentially, no physical violence. They don't attack anyone. Those in power attack.
But Mr. Zizek, I think that's...
Go back to Libya, there it wasn't, I think, an emancipatory movement.
But come on, what we know from social psychology and crowd psychology is that when people gather together, the threshold for violence, the propensity for violence increases. I mean, that's just inherent in the nature of
let's return then to, although I don't idealize all those movements, Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia and so on, but take the disintegration of communism in Hungary, in Czechoslovakia, in Poland, Solidarity and so on, where you had their great crowds. Where did you get violence?
Well, absolutely,
there?
It was peaceful, and perhaps, my thesis at least is that, communism as an idea, as an ideology, simply ran out of steam, and it's not that it was... The
20th century communism, I totally agree with you, it did run out of steam. But I'm saying that but what we got now will breed further explosions of violence if we don't do something.
Okay, let's address a concrete example, which is much closer to my home. I'm talking about Ukraine here, and when you look at some of the exchanges between Russians and Ukrainians, those are very, very depressing, because I think each side tends to think of itself as superior to the other in a moral sense or historic sense, many other senses, but they treat themselves in a very similar manner, especially when they express hatred or arrogance, what have you. And I think you experienced perhaps the same during the breakup of Yugoslavia, with all those different people, sort of thinking that we are better than the others. How do you really overcome that?
All these explosions of violent nationalism came in because, it was precisely the problem, as you put it, at the level of dreams. People's dream originally was not the Western capitalism. People expected something totally different.
Something more basic, better jobs, fair
and
society.
when they didn't get that, but they have no, again, authentic leftist option to fight for that, nationalism enters. And I think this was, in ex-Yugoslavia, there was another point. Maybe the parallel would be with ex-Soviet states like Azerbaijan and so on, that nationalism was also, in ex-Yugoslavia, we should not forget this, a way for the old communist nomenclatura to survive. They quickly changed themselves, reinvented themselves as protectors of national identity, national rights, and so on and so on. I don't think that liberal tolerance will help here. Here it may appear a crazy old-fashioned, but I think that only a renewed, more radical left will work against nationalism.
Well, I don't think they're big fans of radical left in Ukraine these days. Now, I do believe that there is a very genuine movement among the Ukrainian people to make their country better, to make it fair, to build a more prosperous society. But the question is, the more I read about Lenin, the more I wonder about it. In order to succeed in those democratic endeavors, don't you think that Ukraine really needs a leader like Lenin with the same level of pragmatism, the same level of conviction, and the same level of flexibility to push that through, rather than what we have at the moment, which is, again, more or less populist ideas?
At the moment, we have two elements which partially overlap. On the one hand, and it's interesting how little, at least in our Western media, this is reported. I think that definitely one of the key aspects of Ukrainian crisis is the conflict of oligarchs. Forget about the people and so on, the conflict of oligarchs. You have oligarchs who are pro-Russian, you have oligarchs who are pro-Western. A second point is, of course, and it is a strong force, I don't want to ignore it. It's too simple to say Nazis or whatever, but this strong nationalism which definitely has fascist dimensions. Although I think that no side is innocent here.
Absolutely.
Russia is also enjoying the support of Le Pen, of all the Western...
Well, and Russia also has its own nationalists who are unfortunately empowered by this Ukrainian crisis to many extent. I want to ask you one more question. President Poroshenko just recently signed a decree on the so-called decommunization of Ukraine, and to me, that's a very, very interesting phenomenon, because I think there are very, very few countries in history who consciously embarked on this idea of deliberate remodeling of their national identity, partially at least by sort of exercising their past. One example that I can think of was the Soviet Union, that really tried to construct its new identity by denying its past identity. And what I would like to ask you, what do you think is necessary for this social experiment in Ukraine to succeed, rather than allow the people's genuine aspirations to degenerate into something more sinister, like happened with the Soviet Union?
I don't think that let's call it naively, the good emancipatory aspect of Maidan protests and so on, that it has a chance to assert itself.
Why not?
Because I think they are more and more marginalized and so on. I think that, but this is not because of Ukrainians or you Russians are primitive. I claim that what we see in Ukraine is maybe in a more extreme way what we see also in most of the West. It's that the new political polarity is between liberal capitalist center and anti-immigrant nationalist right. This is, it's not just, I'm not blaming Ukrainians for being primitive, but on the contrary, for becoming what Western Europe is unfortunately also becoming. We no longer have this old political dynamics, moderate left, moderate right. replacing each other, exchanging power.
At the end of the day, it's a question of security, not just, lofty ideas, abstract lofty ideas, but also the question of security and survival of not only Ukraine, not only Russia, but also Europe. Don't you think that, again, Europeans, perhaps Russians, perhaps even Americans can do something to really push this conflict in the right direction when, again, we can harness all the good things?
Again, my point is that global capitalism, globally, needs democracy less and less. It is slowly approaching a certain authoritarian model. No wonder that the most successful dynamic countries today are countries like People's Republic of China, South Korea, Singapore, Vietnam, yes, and so on. So that's the irony. And where I don't agree with liberals is when they say, oh, wait a minute, there will be a new Tiananmen and so on. I don't believe in this. I think that really something new is emerging, which worries me. What? If I may develop it very briefly, a new type of society where at the personal level we will be even more free. All that stuff, gay marriages, whatever you want.
You don't have a say in deciding the framework of that freedom
and this is more and more true even in the West. Look, the big decisions are made, all these agreements, trade agreements. We simply don't know what is happening.
Why even in the West? I think it is far more pronounced in the West than in many other countries.
No. I say even in the West because the West tries to proclaim itself being more democratic and so on. No, we just have maybe more of these personal freedoms of choice and so on, but the very frame is maybe even more impenetrable in the West.
Well, Mr. Zizek, on this very, very depressing note, we have to leave it there.
Yes.
I really appreciate you being on the show. And to our viewers, please share your thoughts, concerns on our Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube pages. And I hope to see you again, same place, same time, here on Worlds Apart.